Evelyn tried to hide her panic as the black SUV pulled up beside her. She'd been pacing on the side of the road for 15 minutes after being given firm instructions by her best friend not to move after she'd been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The fight with her boyfriend still echoed in her head in sharp, ugly fragments. His shouting, the sting across her cheek when he struck her, the sound of the car door slamming before he drove off and left her standing in the rain like discarded trash. And now she had to face Marco Bianchi. Wet hair clung to her skin, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, and her face still throbbed where she'd been hit. Worse than any of that was knowing Marco would look at her with those dark, unreadable eyes and see exactly how pathetic she'd become. The passenger door opened before she could decide whether to run or pretend she hadn't seen him. One of Marco's men stepped out first, tall and broad beneath a black coat already dotted with rain. He didn't speak, only inclined his head toward the vehicle in silent instruction. Evelyn swallowed hard and approached on shaky legs. The closer she got, the more the familiar scent of expensive leather and tobacco drifted from inside the SUV. Her stomach twisted painfully. Marco was there. Of course he was. Men like him didn't send someone else to collect the broken pieces. She slid into the vehicle carefully, trying not to drip rainwater everywhere. Warmth wrapped around her instantly, making her suddenly aware of just how cold she'd been. The door shut with a heavy thud behind her, sealing her inside with him. Marco sat beside her in a charcoal suit, one hand resting loosely against his thigh while the other held a blanket. He looked untouched by the storm outside, calm, controlled, dangerous. His dark gaze moved slowly over her face, lingering on the swelling near her cheekbone. Evelyn immediately looked away, shame curling hot and sharp in her chest. For several long seconds, he said nothing. The silence stretched so tightly she could barely breathe through it. Marco had always been terrifyingly observant. He noticed things other people missed. The trembling in her fingers. The bruising was beginning to bloom beneath her skin. The way she kept pulling her sleeves down to cover herself. Evelyn clasped her hands together in her lap, praying he wouldn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. But when Marco finally spoke, his voice came low and dangerously soft. "Who did that to you?" Her throat tightened instantly. "It's fine." Marco's expression did not change. Somehow that made him even scarier. Outside, rain hammered against the windows while the SUV eased back onto the road, smooth and silent beneath them. She could feel the heat of his attention beside her like a living thing. "That," he said evenly, "does not look fine to me." Evelyn forced out a brittle laugh she didn't mean. "Please don't make this into something bigger than it is." Even as she said the words, she hated herself for them. She sounded weak, defensive, exactly like every woman who stayed too long and explained away things that should never have happened. Marco continued watching her, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He reached forward suddenly, fingers brushing lightly beneath her chin to angle her face toward him. The touch was careful, far gentler than she expected from a man with blood on his hands and violence in his eyes. That softness almost broke her. "He hit you." It wasn't a question. Evelyn's eyes burned immediately. She hated crying in front of people, hated looking fragile most of all in front of Marco. Years ago, she'd made the mistake of falling halfway in love with him after one glance across a crowded room. It had been foolish then and impossible now. Marco Bianchi belonged to a world of power, danger, and ruthless men. Women admired him from a distance. They didn't end up with him. And Evelyn certainly wasn't the kind of woman he'd want, especially not sitting bruised and shaking in the back seat of his car after another man discarded her. Marco withdrew his hand slowly, though his eyes never left hers. Something dark moved behind them then. Not pity. Marco didn't pity anyone. This was colder than that, more dangerous. What's his name? Her pulse jumped. Marco. What, he repeated quietly, is his name? She hesitated too long. Marco leaned back against the leather seat, his expression smoothing into something unreadable again. But the tension in the vehicle shifted instantly. Even the men in the front seat seemed stiffer somehow. She suddenly remembered every whispered story she'd ever heard about Marco Bianchi. Men disappearing, businesses burned to the ground, debts collected in blood. Fear climbed into her throat. "Please," she whispered, "don't do anything." Marco looked at her for another long moment before unfolding the blanket and draping it carefully around her shoulders. The gesture felt strangely intimate despite the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. His fingers lingered for the briefest second near her collarbone before he pulled away. "Too late for that, Tesoro," he murmured darkly. "The moment he put his hands on you, he became my problem." She looked up at him and wished in that moment that she'd called anybody else. When Evelyn had called Gina in tears, barely able to get the words out properly through her panic, Gina hadn't hesitated for even a second. One moment she'd been laughing somewhere in the middle of the loud Bianchi family gathering, surrounded by cousins and music and too much food, and the next she'd stepped away with murder in her eyes as she listened to Evelyn explain that Rick had abandoned her on the side of the road. By the time Evelyn admitted he'd hit her, Gina had already been moving. Her first port of call after hanging up hadn't been to the police. It had been to her brother. Marco had been halfway through a conversation with one of their brothers when Gina stormed into the private study of their home. The room had immediately gone silent at the look on her face. Gina Bianchi was beautiful, sharp-tongued, and dramatic by nature, but when she was truly angry there was something frighteningly similar to Marco in her expression. She'd marched straight toward him, phone still in hand. "Evie's boyfriend left her stranded off the highway," she'd snapped without preamble. "And if you don't bring her back to me in one piece, I swear to God I'll help bury you myself." The room had gone deathly still after that. Most men would have laughed off a threat from their younger sister. Marco did not. He simply stood, already reaching for his coat before she'd even finished speaking. The mention of Evelyn alone had been enough to send a cold wave of fury through him, so sharp it almost tasted metallic. Everything else after that, the fact it was night, the rain, the isolation of the road she'd been left on, only made it worse. A dangerous calm had settled over him instantly, the kind that made the men around him exchange wary glances and quietly clear out of his way. "She's alone?" he'd asked. Gina's face had tightened. "She said she's near the old service road past Belridge. He dumped her there after they fought." Her voice had cracked slightly then, anger giving way to worry. "Marco," she sounded terrified. That had done it. Marco had left immediately, ignoring the calls of relatives behind him as he strode through the house. Rain had already been falling heavily outside, coating the city streets in silver reflections. One of his men hurried after him with an umbrella, but Marco barely noticed. His thoughts were already miles away, fixed entirely on Evelyn. He pictured her standing alone beside a dark road soaked by rain and frightened out of her mind, and something brutal twisted low in his chest. Evelyn was soft-hearted in ways the world punished too easily. She trusted too much, forgave too quickly. Men like that saw kindness and treated it like weakness. Marco gripped the phone harder as the SUV cut through the rain-slick roads toward the highway. Luca quietly updated him on the route while another man made calls in the background, already gathering information on Evelyn and her boyfriend. Marco listened with only half his attention. His mind kept drifting elsewhere, to the memory of Evelyn laughing across their kitchen table months ago, to the warmth in her eyes whenever she spoke to him, even when she tried to hide it. He'd spent years forcing distance between them because wanting her had never been safe. For her, for him. But tonight, every protective instinct he possessed had risen violently to the surface. The thought of her being vulnerable out there alone made his stomach turn darkly. He knew exactly what kind of things happened to women stranded at night. He'd spent most of his life surrounded by predators. He understood danger intimately. The highway she'd been left on stretched through isolated bushland with long, empty roads between towns. Minimal traffic, poor lighting, a perfect place for something terrible to happen. The image of Evelyn, frightened and defenseless beneath the rain, pushed something savage awake inside him. Her boyfriend better hope he reached Evelyn before anyone else did. His phone rang once during the drive. Gina again. "Well?" she demanded immediately. "I'm almost there." "You better be." Her voice shook with emotion now beneath the fury. "She's my family, Marco." The words lingered heavily after the call ended. She's my family. Marco stared out at the rain-dark road ahead, jaw tightening. Gina wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the line, Evelyn had become tangled in the fabric of the Bianchis so naturally, it no longer felt unusual when she appeared at family dinners or Sunday lunches. She belonged there. More dangerously, Marco had started thinking of her as his long before he had any right to. Quietly, secretly, possessively. He'd buried those feelings deep because men like him destroyed things they touched. But tonight, hearing she'd been hurt, abandoned and left vulnerable in the dark, every carefully built wall inside him had cracked. Then he'd finally seen her, standing alone beneath the storm with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, pacing anxiously along the roadside while headlights illuminated her soaked figure. Relief had hit him first, violent enough to nearly stagger him, followed immediately by rage when he caught sight of the bruise forming on her face. In that instant, Rick sealed his own fate without even knowing it. Marco had climbed from the SUV, already certain of one thing. He was never going to leave Evelyn unprotected again. "Gina has been coordinating your rescue by the minute," he muttered dryly as he pulled his phone from his pocket. Evelyn huffed out the faintest laugh despite herself. That sounded exactly like Gina. Dramatic, loud, emotionally unhinged in moments of crisis. Marco pressed the dial and the call barely rang once before his sister answered. "Tell me you have her?" Gina demanded immediately, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I do." You could literally hear her take a breath. "Tu, qui, adesso, subito, niente discussioni. Farò legare Marco se necessario. Ho bisogno di vedere con I miei occhi che stai bene. You, here, now, right now. No arguments. I'll have Marco tie you up. I need to see that you are okay myself. Then, stai bene?" "Sto bene," she answered smoothly in flawless Italian. "Fradicia, la faccia mi fa male da morire, ma sto bene." "I'm fine. Soaked, my face hurts like a son of a bitch, but I'm fine." Marco's head turned toward her immediately, now looking down at her. The moment the SUV rolled through the gates of the Bianchi estate, Evelyn's stomach tightened all over again. Warm golden light spilt from the enormous windows of the house, illuminating the rain-slicked driveway and the ivy climbing the stone walls. Normally the place felt lively and welcoming, chaotic in the way all large family homes seemed to be. Tonight it felt different, tense, waiting. Marco barely let the vehicle stop fully before he climbed out, circling to open her door himself, while rain continued to fall steadily around them. The front doors opened before they even reached them. Gina stood at the bottom of the grand staircase in oversized pants and an oversized sweater, looking like she'd been pacing for the last hour. Beside her stood Melina Bianchi, elegant even this late at night, in a dark sweater and dress pants, gold jewelry glinting softly beneath the foyer lights. The instant Evelyn stepped inside, Gina moved first, but Melina reached her before anyone else could. "Oh, tesoro!" Melina breathed. She gathered Evelyn into her arms immediately, warm and gentle despite the fury already brewing beneath the surface. Evelyn melted a little at the embrace before she could stop herself. The maternal softness of it nearly cracked the fragile control she'd been holding together since the roadside. Melina pulled back only enough to cup Evelyn's face carefully between her hands. Her expression changed instantly when she saw the bruising properly beneath the foyer lighting. Absolute fury. Her dark eyes sharpened as she tilted Evelyn's chin slightly, inspecting the swelling with terrifying calm. The air in the foyer shifted subtly. Evelyn felt it immediately. Gina went silent. Even the staff, lingering discreetly nearby, suddenly became very interested in looking elsewhere. Melina Bianchi looked over Evelyn's shoulder directly at her son. The silent exchange between mother and son sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Marco stood a few feet behind her, rain still clinging to his dark hair and coat, his expression unreadable. But something cold moved through his eyes as they locked onto his mother's. They didn't need words. Somehow they understood each other perfectly. Melina's gaze practically said, "Not in my house," while Marco's expression suggested he was already several steps ahead of her. Then, just as quickly, Melina's face softened again when she looked back at Evelyn. She murmured gently, brushing damp hair away from Evelyn's cheek. "We'll fix that right up for you, Bambina." Her tone left absolutely no room for argument. "Go upstairs now and change. We'll see you in the dining room when you're ready." Evelyn managed a small smile despite the exhaustion weighing her down. "Thank you." Gina immediately took her hand, already tugging her toward the stairs like an overprotective bodyguard prepared to physically fight anyone who got too close. Evelyn allowed herself to be led halfway up before something twisted uncomfortably in her chest. She slowed suddenly. Marco hadn't moved. He still stood near the doorway watching her with that same dark, unreadable focus that made her pulse unsteady. And all at once she knew exactly what he intended to do next. The realization tightened her stomach sharply enough that she stopped on the stairs altogether. "Marco!" His gaze lifted immediately. Evelyn hesitated, fingers tightening slightly around the staircase railing before she turned fully toward him. Gina looked between them suspiciously, but stayed quiet. "Before you go," Evelyn said carefully, "I know you'll go to him to have a conversation." Marco's expression did not change, though something colder settled over the room. "And before you do," she continued slowly, "you need to know I lied." That got his full attention. Marco went completely still. "You lied?" His voice was soft, low enough that it somehow sounded far more dangerous than shouting ever could. Evelyn winced slightly under the weight of his stare. "He's probably going to tell you I broke his hand." Silence. Then she shrugged one shoulder weakly. "I did." For a second, nobody in the foyer spoke. Gina blinked. Melina's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Somewhere behind them, Luca choked suspiciously hard on what might have been a laugh before immediately pretending to cough. Marco stared at Evelyn like he wasn't entirely sure he'd heard her correctly. "And the lie?" he asked cautiously. Evelyn looked suddenly embarrassed. "I told him I'd cut them off if he ever hit me." She grimaced slightly. "But I didn't have anything to do it with, so—" Another shrug. "I hit his hand with my shoe, hard." A beat of stunned silence passed. Then Gina made a noise that sounded suspiciously close to proud delight. Melina slowly covered her mouth, though Evelyn could see the unmistakable amusement threatening underneath her composure. Even Marco's men near the doorway looked like they were fighting very hard not to react. Marco himself remained motionless for several long seconds before lowering his head briefly, one hand dragging slowly across his mouth as though trying to hide something. When he finally looked back up at Evelyn, there was the faintest trace of reluctant admiration in his eyes. "You broke his hand with a shoe," he repeated quietly. Evelyn shifted awkwardly. "Technically, yes." Marco stared at her another second longer before a low, rough laugh escaped him unexpectedly for the first time all night. Dark and brief, and genuinely surprised. It changed his entire face. Evelyn's breath caught slightly at the sound. Then his expression hardened again almost instantly. "Good," he said calmly. "Now I only have to break the other one." Gina fussed over Evelyn for the rest of the night with the intensity of an anxious mother hen guarding an injured chick. The moment Evelyn came downstairs after showering and changing into borrowed clothes, Gina descended on her with a blanket, painkillers, tea, food, and at one point an ice pack she tried to physically hold against Evelyn's face herself. Every time Evelyn so much as blinked too slowly, Gina demanded to know if she was dizzy. If she looked tired, Gina threatened to drag her upstairs and tuck her into bed personally. It was ridiculous, overwhelming, and so deeply affectionate that Evelyn found herself fighting emotion all over again. The Bianchi family absorbed her into the warmth of the evening without hesitation. Nobody asked invasive questions. Nobody pushed her to explain what happened. Instead, they simply made space for her at the long dining table as if she belonged there naturally. Plates of food kept appearing in front of her, despite her insistence that she wasn't hungry. Someone poured her wine. Someone else tucked another dessert onto her plate after dinner. The noise and movement around her created a strange sort of comfort. Loud Italian voices layered over laughter, overlapping conversations, and endless teasing arguments that somehow always circled back to food. Still, despite the warmth surrounding her, Evelyn remained painfully aware of Marco's presence, or rather the frustrating lack of it. She only caught glimpses of him throughout the night, a shadow moving through the hallway. The low murmur of his voice was somewhere in another room. Once she saw him standing near the study, speaking quietly with two men in dark suits, his expression cold enough to make her stomach tighten uneasily. Another time she caught him watching her from across the dining room, while everyone argued loudly over whose grandmother made the best sauce recipe. The moment their eyes met, he looked away first and disappeared again. That bothered her more than it should have. As if sensing she needed distracting, Gina's brother practically adopted Evelyn for the evening. Andrea and Luca rarely left her side for more than 5 minutes at a time, escorting her from room to room as though Marco had assigned them unofficial bodyguard duty. Not that she minded much. Andrea was endlessly entertaining, full of animated energy and dramatic storytelling, while Luca possessed a quieter humor that appeared out of nowhere so dryly it caught her off guard every time. At one point, Andrea became fascinated after hearing Evelyn switch between English and Italian effortlessly while speaking with Melina in the kitchen. "You sound different in Italian," he announced thoughtfully, leaning back in his chair with a wine glass dangling loosely from his fingers. Evelyn laughed softly. "Different how?" "Softer," Luca supplied from beside her, "but meaner somehow." Andrea pointed at him immediately. "Yes, exactly that." Evelyn rolled her eyes while Gina snorted into her drink. Andrea then launched enthusiastically into explaining that he'd recently started learning Spanish because he planned to spend the summer in Barcelona. Unfortunately, according to Luca, his accent was a crime against multiple languages. This naturally started a loud argument between them that dragged Evelyn into the middle of it. Before long, Andrea was demanding she explain the differences between Italian and Spanish pronunciation, since she was apparently fluent in both. Evelyn smiled despite herself, settling back slightly in her chair. Okay, but this only makes sense if you think like Italians. Andrea immediately slapped the table triumphantly. See, I told you there was a correct way. We are Italian after all. The pronunciation differences aren't just about language, Evelyn explained patiently. It's culture. Italians are very attached to rhythm and tradition when we speak. Spanish flows differently. It's sharper in places, faster. Italian is more deliberate. She gestured lightly with her hand as she spoke, unconsciously mirroring the exact expressive movements surrounding her all evening. We stretch words, we romanticize syllables, even insults sound passionate. Luca grinned. That might be the most Italian explanation I've ever heard. It's true, Evelyn defended, laughing softly now. Italian families grow up treating language like part of identity. Tradition matters to us. Pronunciation matters. Food, names, gestures, everything means something. As she spoke, she noticed movement near the doorway. Marco. He'd entered quietly sometime during the conversation, one hand tucked into his pocket as he paused near the archway leading into the dining room. His attention rested entirely on her now. Evelyn faltered slightly beneath the weight of his gaze. He looked different tonight without the rain and tension from earlier. Cleaner somehow, controlled again, but his eyes remained intense as they watched her animatedly explaining Italian dialects to his brothers like she'd always belonged there. Andrea noticed him first. Marco, he called immediately. Evie says Italians romanticize everything. Marco's eyes stayed on Evelyn as the corner of his mouth lifted faintly. She's right, he said simply. Something warm curled low in Evelyn's stomach at the quiet approval in his voice. It shouldn't have affected her the way it did. But all evening he'd remained distant, just out of reach, and now suddenly his attention settled fully on her again. Focused, heavy, dangerous to her peace of mind. Then Gina appeared beside him out of nowhere and narrowed her eyes suspiciously between them both. "No flirting," she announced firmly. The entire table burst into laughter while Evelyn nearly choked on her wine. Marco, infuriatingly, looked completely unbothered. He merely held Evelyn's gaze another second longer before answering calmly, "You say that like I was speaking," which somehow only made everyone laugh harder. Evelyn was absolutely exhausted by the time she finally crawled into bed. Her body felt bruised from the inside out, every muscle aching with the aftermath of stress, adrenaline, and the freezing rain she'd spent too long standing in the night before. Even her eyelids hurt. Against her better judgment, and despite Gina practically threatening to sedate her, if she even thought about work, Evelyn still set her alarm for 7 in the morning. Habit more than responsibility at this point. Her life had always depended on her holding everything together herself. The alarm dragged her violently from sleep. The second she opened her eyes, she regretted it. Her head was pounding so hard, it felt like someone was driving nails behind her eyes. Her throat burned. Every inch of her body felt strangely heavy beneath the blankets, her skin too hot and too cold at the same time. Groaning softly, she fumbled blindly for her phone on the bedside table before forcing herself to dial work. Maybe she could at least explain she'd need a sick day before collapsing again. Peterson answered almost immediately. "Evelyn," he said sharply, "what are you doing? Shouldn't you be resting?" Confused, Evelyn frowned into the pillow. "What?" she croaked. Even to her own ears she sounded terrible. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Peterson continued carefully. "Mr. Bianchi already called to say you would be taking leave for personal reasons for now. He said you'd work remotely when you were feeling better, and that we should send over anything necessary." Peterson's tone shifted slightly, becoming almost awkwardly respectful. He was very clear. Evelyn closed her eyes slowly. Marco. Of course it had been Marco, Somehow, overnight, he had quietly stepped into her life and reorganized it without asking permission. Work handled, leave arranged, expectations managed. She should have been furious. Honestly, she probably would have been if she possessed enough energy to manage it. Instead, something warm and painfully relieving unfurled inside her chest. For once, she didn't have to fix everything herself. Someone else had simply taken care of it. "Okay," she whispered weakly. "Thank you." Then she hung up and immediately fell back asleep before her phone even slipped fully from her hand. When she woke again hours later, she thought for one disoriented second the room was on fire. Heat smothered her from every direction. Her skin was damp beneath the sheets, soaked with sweat, while the pounding in her head had somehow worsened. The room spun slightly when she pushed herself upright. Her throat felt like she'd swallowed sandpaper and glass simultaneously. She sat there for a long moment, blinking slowly, trying to gather enough strength to think. Water. She needed water. Dragging the duvet aside, Evelyn stumbled out of bed. She'd changed into sleep clothes sometime during the night, a tiny pair of pajama shorts and a thin singlet borrowed from Gina, but now both clung damply to her overheated skin. Her hair was a tangled mess around her shoulders as she wandered downstairs half awake, one hand dragging along the wall for balance. The house was quiet beneath the afternoon sunlight, pouring through the enormous windows. Then a door opened. Marco stepped out of his office at the far end of the hallway, loosening the cuffs of his black dress shirt as he glanced up absently. The second he saw her, he stopped dead. Evelyn blinked at him blearily. Marco's gaze swept over her once, too quickly to be inappropriate, too thoroughly not to notice everything anyway. The soaked fabric clinging to her skin, the flushed heat in her cheeks, the fact she looked 1 second away from collapsing entirely. Something dark entered his expression immediately. "Evelyn," he said slowly, voice dropping lower. She frowned at him and winced like he'd shouted in her ear. "Who turned the heater up?" she croaked miserably. Marco's eyes narrowed instantly. In 5 long strides he reached her, one large hand coming up to press against her forehead. The second his skin touched hers, his jaw tightened hard. Evelyn was burning alive beneath his palm, feverish enough that even in her haze she noticed the alarm flash across his face. "Christ," he swore under his breath. Before she could protest, Marco bent and lifted her clean off the ground. Evelyn made a weak noise of outrage, instinctively clutching at his shoulders as the room tilted sickeningly around her. "You swore!" "I'm telling your mother," she whispered hoarsely. Marco snorted once, already carrying her back upstairs with infuriating ease. "My mother will agree with me." "Maybe, but she likes me more," Evelyn mumbled. "That's true," he admitted darkly. By the time they reached the bedroom again, Evelyn felt like she was drifting in and out of consciousness. Her skin burned while chills still racked through her body violently enough to hurt. Marco carried her straight toward the bed, but the moment he lowered her slightly, she shook her head weakly, grabbed him as tightly as she could and pointed accusingly at the blankets. "It's hot as hell down there," she rasped. Marco glanced at the sweat-soaked sheets, once before muttering another curse in Italian. Then, without hesitation, he adjusted his grip and carried her right back out of the room again while shouting down the hallway for fresh bedding and a doctor. Evelyn drifted in and out of consciousness for what felt like hours. Time became slippery and strange, dissolving into fragments of voices, cool hands against her skin, and the distant sound of movement somewhere around her. Every time she surfaced properly, the pounding in her head seemed worse. Her body ached so deeply it felt like her bones themselves were exhausted. Fever wrapped around her in suffocating waves, dragging her back under every time she tried to stay awake for more than a few seconds. At some point, a doctor arrived. She vaguely remembered an older man with silver hair and tired eyes. stepping into the room carrying a medical bag, while Marco stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, and an expression dark enough to intimidate everyone present. Gina hovered anxiously nearby while Melina calmly directed staff in the background, like a battlefield commander managing a crisis. The doctor had taken one look at Evelyn before muttering something about exposure, stress, exhaustion, dehydration, and infection all at once. Now an IV line sat taped to her arm, fluids dripping steadily into her system, while another medication burned coolly through her veins for her throat and fever. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with fresh linen and the lingering traces of Marco's cologne from earlier. Evelyn hated all of it. She hated feeling weak most of all. Gina paced the bedroom like a caged animal. Back and forth, back and forth. Every few minutes she'd stop dramatically at Evelyn's bedside to demand if she needed anything before immediately spiraling again without waiting for an answer. Luca had attempted to calm her down once and nearly been murdered for suggesting she sit still. Now he wisely lingered near the doorway with Andrea, both watching Gina like nervous wildlife observers. Evelyn groaned and threw an arm weakly over her eyes. "My head is bloody killing me," she complained loudly in Italian. The room fell silent for 1 second. Then Andrea burst into startled laughter. "There she is," he declared triumphantly, near death and still swearing like a tiny angry grandmother. Gina pointed aggressively at him. "Do not make fun of her. She nearly died." "You made fun of her this morning," Luca reminded her. "That was before she developed plague symptoms." "I don't have the plague," Evelyn muttered miserably from the bed. "You look haunted," Andrea offered. "Thank you, Andrea," she deadpanned weakly. Marco appeared in the doorway again then, drawing everyone's attention instantly without even trying. He'd removed his suit jacket hours ago and rolled the sleeves of his black shirt to his forearms, though somehow he still looked unnervingly composed, despite the chaos unfolding around him. His dark gaze moved immediately to Evelyn, assessing her condition in one quiet sweep that somehow felt more thorough than the doctor's examination. "You should sleep," he said. Evelyn narrowed her eyes at him from beneath flushed cheeks. "Why do you always sound so bossy?" His mouth twitched faintly. "Because you're impossible." "She's delirious," Gina announced solemnly. "Earlier she asked me if the ceiling fan was speaking Italian." Evelyn frowned weakly, confused. "It was." Andrea nearly fell against the wall laughing, while even Luca looked dangerously close to losing composure. Gina herself cracked a reluctant grin before immediately smoothing it away again to resume worrying professionally. Marco, however, crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed beside Evelyn without the slightest hesitation. The mattress dipped beneath his weight. Even feverish and miserable, Evelyn noticed the immediate coolness he brought with him, the steady grounding presence that seemed to settle the room slightly whenever he entered it. Marco reached out, brushing damp hair away from her forehead, before resting the back of his hand lightly against her skin again, his brows pulled together immediately. "Still too hot," he muttered. Evelyn squinted up at him blearily. "That's because Satan lives in this room." A surprised sound escaped Luca somewhere behind him. Marco exhaled quietly through his nose, clearly fighting amusement despite himself. "You're very dramatic when you're sick." "Of course she is. She gets that from us," Gina said proudly. Melina entered then carrying fresh tea and immediately took in the scene with sharp maternal eyes. "Why is everyone standing around her bed like mourners at a funeral?" she demanded. "Out, all of you. She needs quiet and rest." Nobody argued with Melina Bianchi. Andrea and Luca disappeared first. Gina lingered stubbornly until her mother pointed firmly toward the door without a word. Grumbling dramatically in Italian, Gina finally obeyed. though not before kissing Evelyn's forehead and threatening Marco with bodily harm if he let her die. Then suddenly the room was quiet. Only Marco remained seated beside the bed while the IV dripped softly in the background. Evelyn shifted weakly beneath the blankets, exhaustion dragging at her again. Her eyes struggled to stay open. Somewhere through the fever haze, she became aware of Marco reaching for her hand, resting against the sheets. His fingers wrapped around hers carefully, surprisingly gentle for a man capable of terrifying entire rooms with a glance. "You're safe here, Evelyn," he said quietly. The words settled somewhere deep inside her, before sleep finally pulled her under again. 3 days. 3 entire days disappeared into fever dreams, exhaustion, and brief moments of painful awareness before darkness dragged Evelyn under again. Later, Gina would dramatically inform her she'd basically died for 72 hours, which Melina immediately corrected because apparently there were limits to acceptable exaggeration even within the Bianchi family. Evelyn remembered almost none of it properly, only fragments remained. Cool cloths against her forehead, voices murmuring nearby, the bitter taste of medicine, someone constantly trying to force soup into her. Mostly, though, she remembered the headache. It had settled behind her eyes like a punishment from God himself, throbbing relentlessly every time she opened them. Her throat felt raw enough to make swallowing miserable, every breath scraping painfully on the way down. At one point, she genuinely wondered if death might be less irritating than another bowl of broth. Unfortunately, Melina Bianchi took nourishment personally, and apparently refusing food in her house counted as a criminal offense. So Evelyn endured. Barely. Most of the time, Gina helped her to the bathroom because standing alone proved overly ambitious. Evelyn would wake vaguely enough to realize she was leaning heavily against Gina, while muttering complaints in broken Italian and English, before promptly falling asleep again the second she returned to bed. Gina, despite all her dramatic whining, never once complained. She braided Evelyn's hair away from her sweaty face, bullied her into drinking water, and threatened violence toward anyone who made too much noise outside the bedroom. Marco had been there too, not constantly in the obvious sense. Evelyn rarely remembered actually seeing him properly, but somehow every time she surfaced from sleep, she was aware of him nearby, sometimes seated quietly in the armchair near the window with paperwork spread across his lap, sometimes speaking in low tones with the doctor. Once she vaguely remembered waking to find him replacing the cold cloth on her forehead with surprising gentleness before she drifted off again. Another time she woke enough to hear Gina whispering aggressively, "You need to sleep too." "I'm fine." That's not convincing when you haven't changed clothes in 2 days. Evelyn remembered trying to open her eyes at that point, only to fail spectacularly. Later, once her fever finally began breaking enough for actual coherent conversation, Gina delighted herself by recounting several things Evelyn had apparently said while delirious. "You accused Andrea of stealing your eyebrows," Gina informed her cheerfully while handing over tea. Evelyn blinked slowly. "Why would Andrea steal my eyebrows?" "He cried laughing for 10 minutes, Gina replied proudly. Apparently Luca had suffered the worst of it, though. Evelyn had absolutely no memory of this whatsoever, but according to Gina, the entire incident occurred sometime around 2 in the morning, when Marco had been sitting beside the bed, attempting to convince Evelyn to drink water. Luca had wandered in half asleep to check on her, while eating crackers for reasons nobody understood. "And then," Gina said, already wheezing with laughter before she could finish, "Marco told you our children would be cute." Evelyn froze mid-sip. "What?" Gina collapsed dramatically against the bed, laughing harder now. "You pointed at him like this?" She jabbed an accusing finger through the air and said, "You're a liar." "Oh my God." "And then," Gina gasped, wiping tears from her eyes. You pointed at Luca and asked, then what happened there? From the doorway came a deeply offended voice. I'm still recovering emotionally. Luca stood there, holding a plate of toast, while Andrea leaned against the wall beside him, openly laughing again at the memory. Evelyn stared at them in horror, while heat flooded her face despite the lingering fever. I did not. You absolutely did, Andrea confirmed instantly. Marco almost choked, trying not to laugh. Evelyn buried her face in her hands with a groan. Please kill me now. No, Luca replied solemnly. You've already done enough damage. What did Marco say? She asked cautiously through her fingers. The room went suspiciously quiet for 1 second too long. Andrea grinned first. Nothing. Gina immediately snorted. That's because he was staring at you like a man already mentally designing wedding invitations. Gina, Evelyn hissed weakly. What? I'm just saying. Nobody watches someone sleep through 3 days of fever unless they're deeply emotionally compromised. From somewhere deeper in the house came the unmistakable sound of Marco's voice approaching. Luca immediately straightened. Andrea suddenly became fascinated by the ceiling. Gina looked utterly delighted by the timing. Evelyn's heart betrayed her instantly by speeding up. Then Marco stepped into the room. His dark eyes moved over her once, assessing, checking, making sure she was upright and coherent, before some invisible tension eased slightly from his shoulders. He looked exhausted beneath the calm surface, though only someone paying close attention would notice it. Unfortunately for Evelyn, she was paying very close attention now. Marco glanced between the suspiciously amused faces in the room before settling on her flushed expression. His gaze narrowed faintly. What happened? Gina smiled like a demon. Oh, she said sweetly, we were just discussing your future children. Evelyn groaned in absolute humiliation and yanked the blankets over her face. Uccidimi adesso. Kill me now. Andrea immediately lost whatever composure he had left, laughing loudly as Gina nearly fell sideways against the wall. Even Luca looked vindicated by her suffering now. Evelyn contemplated simply remaining beneath the blankets forever. It seemed like the safest option for everyone involved. Give me the room. Marco's voice cut cleanly through the chaos. The amusement died instantly. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made people move without thinking twice. Andrea straightened immediately. Luca muttered something about surviving yet another attack on his character before heading for the door. Gina lingered longest, narrowing her eyes suspiciously at her brother like she expected him to emotionally damage her best friend somehow. Marco, she warned, out. Gina sighed dramatically toward the ceiling before pointing at him. If she cries, I'm keying your car. You don't drive. You have plenty of keys I can use. Then finally the room emptied, leaving behind quiet once more. Marco crossed the room slowly and lowered himself into the chair beside the bed. The mattress rustled softly as Evelyn reluctantly lowered the blankets, enough to peer at him. He looked calmer than he had the past few days, though there was still something tightly controlled sitting behind his eyes. Something heavy. Evelyn, he said softly. The way he said her name made her stomach tighten slightly. Gentle, careful, serious, immediately suspicious, she squinted at him through lingering fever exhaustion. We need to talk? She shook her head carefully before he could answer too quickly, wincing immediately because apparently moving too fast still offended her entire nervous system. No, she mumbled, it's okay. Fever babble doesn't hold up in a court of law. She waved weakly toward the door. Luca baby comments don't count. To her surprise, Marco's mouth twitched faintly. Then the amusement disappeared just as quickly. It's about Rick, he said quietly. The room seemed to cool slightly. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment before sinking lower into the pillows. "Nope," she muttered tiredly. "I don't need to know. Rick made his choice the moment he put his hands on me." Her voice roughened slightly despite herself. "We're done." Marco studied her silently for a moment before leaning forward, forearms resting loosely against his knees. "What about that night?" he asked carefully. "Do you know why you were so far out there?" Evelyn frowned immediately. The question scraped against something uncomfortable in the back of her mind. She tried to focus properly, but her thoughts still felt sluggish from fever and exhaustion. Fragments drifted through her head disconnectedly. The fight, Rick driving too fast, her asking where they were going, him snapping at her to stop asking questions. "I don't—" She pressed fingers lightly against her temple. "I probably do, but I can't." Frustration tightened her voice. "I can't find it in my head." Marco stayed very still. Too still. Slowly, Evelyn looked up at him properly. There was something in his expression she didn't like, something cautious, controlled, like he was trying to decide how much truth she could handle right now. Her stomach twisted instinctively. "What aren't you saying?" she whispered. Marco's jaw tightened once. Then he answered quietly, "Rick was meeting someone." Evelyn waited. When Marco didn't continue immediately, dread began crawling slowly up her spine. "Someone well known," he said carefully, "for trafficking." The word landed heavily between them. Evelyn blinked. Marco's eyes never left hers now. "Women!" For a second, the room seemed to tilt. No, that didn't make sense. Rick was selfish, cruel sometimes, angry, but that— Evelyn stared at Marco blankly, trying to force the information into something understandable. Her thoughts moved sluggishly, refusing to connect properly. She remembered Rick insisting on taking the isolated road, remembered him acting strange all evening, aggressive, distracted, panicked whenever she asked questions. Then she remembered him grabbing her wrist hard enough to bruise when she demanded he turn the car around. A cold wave rolled through her body so violently it made her nauseous. Marco saw the exact second realization began forming. "Oh my God," Evelyn whispered. Her breathing turned shallow instantly. "Oh my God." She looked at Marco with wide, horrified eyes that were suddenly far too clear despite the fever haze. Had Rick been taking her there intentionally? To those men? To sell her? The thought hit so hard her stomach lurched painfully. "No," she whispered immediately, shaking her head too quickly. "No, he wouldn't." But even as she said it, pieces began locking together inside her mind with terrifying clarity. The remote road, the secrecy, the rage when she questioned him, the way he'd looked almost desperate before she broke his hand. Marco moved immediately when her breathing became uneven, reaching for her before she could spiral fully into panic. His hand closed firmly around hers. "Evelyn!" She barely heard him. All she could think was that if she hadn't fought back, if Gina hadn't answered the phone, if Marco hadn't come, her entire body started trembling. "No," Evelyn whispered again, but the word sounded thin now, fragile, like it was breaking apart even as she said it. Her breathing became uneven, sharp little pulls of air that weren't enough to steady the panic climbing through her body. Marco tightened his grip on her hand immediately, but Evelyn barely seemed aware of him anymore. Her gaze had gone distant, unfocused on the room around her, as her mind spiraled somewhere darker. "I would have disappeared," she said suddenly. Marco's expression sharpened. "Evelyn, I would have just—" She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "Gone missing." The words hit the room with terrible weight. Marco moved closer instinctively, leaning forward in the chair beside the bed, while Evelyn continued staring somewhere past him entirely. She looked pale beneath the lingering fever flush, her eyes glassy with exhaustion and panic all tangled together. He could almost see the thoughts unraveling too fast inside her head. "They would have buried me somewhere," she whispered shakily, "or dumped me someplace nobody would ever find me." "Stop." His voice came low and firm immediately, but Evelyn shook her head weakly against the pillows, tears finally slipping free now. "No, because it's true." Her breathing hitched painfully. "People disappear like that all the time. Nobody would have known where I was." She looked at him then, terrified in a way that reached far deeper than the fever ever had. "I would have died someplace where nobody even knew my name." Marco's chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. "Evelyn," he said again, quieter this time. But she kept going once the thoughts started. She couldn't stop them. "I never would have seen Gina again," she whispered, "or your mother, or Luca and Andrea annoying me for the rest of my life." A broken laugh escaped her before another tear slid down her face. "You all would have just waited." Marco stood abruptly then, unable to stay sitting across from her another second. He moved onto the edge of the bed beside her immediately, one hand bracing carefully near her shoulder, while the other reached for her face. "You're here," he said firmly. "Look at me." She did. And somehow that made it worse. Fresh panic crashed through her expression as she stared at him. "And I wouldn't have seen you again." Something inside Marco twisted violently at the rawness in her voice. Evelyn made a small, helpless sound before covering her face briefly with trembling hands. "I didn't even—" Her words broke apart. "I didn't even get to kiss you." Marco froze. Silence filled the room instantly. Evelyn seemed to realize what she'd said about 3 full seconds too late. Her eyes widened in horror behind tear-filled lashes, while Marco stared at her motionlessly. For one disorienting moment, he genuinely wondered if the fever was still high enough to make her delirious again. But no, he could tell the difference now. The fever haze was mostly gone from her eyes. Her speech was clearer, her reaction sharper. This wasn't delirium, this was panic colliding headfirst with exhaustion and fear, and the emotional aftermath she hadn't yet processed. Evelyn wasn't babbling nonsense anymore, she was unraveling, and somehow, in the middle of that panic, the truth had slipped out accidentally. Evelyn looked seconds away from combusting from humiliation now. She made a strangled noise and tried to pull the blankets over her face again. "Forget I said that." Marco caught the blankets before she could disappear beneath them. "No." The word came out rougher than he intended. Evelyn blinked at him. Marco exhaled slowly, forcing control back into himself, because right now she was terrified, exhausted, emotionally overloaded, and absolutely not in a state for him to react honestly to what she'd just admitted. Even though every protective instinct and every buried feeling inside him had violently come alive at once. So instead, he focused on the panic first. "You are safe," he said quietly, firmly enough that she had to hear it. "Nothing happened to you, nobody took you, nobody is ever going to take you." Her breathing still shook unevenly. Marco reached up carefully, brushing damp strands of hair back from her flushed face. "You're overwhelmed," he murmured. "That's all this is. Your body's exhausted, your head's racing, and you're trying to process something horrible all at once." Evelyn stared at him silently. Then, in a very small voice, she whispered, "I was really close, wasn't I?" Marco held her gaze for a long moment before answering honestly. "Yes." She flinched like the truth physically hurt. Immediately, Marco slid an arm around her shoulders and pulled her gently against his chest before she could retreat from him again. Evelyn resisted for all of half a second before collapsing into him completely, trembling hard enough he could still feel the lingering adrenaline beneath her skin. Marco rested his chin lightly against the top of her head and closed his eyes briefly. "You're here now," he repeated softly, "and I'm not letting anything happen to you again." Marco stood motionless beside the office window, one hand braced against the edge of the desk, while rain lashed softly against the glass outside. The room was dim except for the low amber lighting from the desk lamp and the fire burning quietly in the hearth. Gina sat perched on the edge of the leather sofa, tension radiating from her in sharp waves, while Melina remained seated behind the desk with the calm stillness of a queen awaiting bad news. Marco had already sent everyone else out. What he was about to say was for family only. She was the target. The words landed heavily in the silence. Gina's face lost all color instantly. "No." Marco dragged a hand slowly across his mouth, jaw tight enough to ache. Rick was meeting with traffickers. Saying it aloud made the fury inside him sharpen all over again. They were looking for Evelyn specifically. For one terrible second, nobody spoke. Then Gina stood so abruptly the sofa nearly tipped backward. "No." Her voice cracked violently this time. "No, Marco, tell me you're wrong." "I wish I was." The room seemed to darken around them. Melina closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly through her nose before opening them again. Rage sat beneath her composure now, cold and elegant and deadly. It reminded Marco painfully of himself. "How close?" she asked quietly. Marco looked away toward the rain-streaked window. Too close. The thought alone made something savage move inside his chest. If Evelyn hadn't fought back, if she hadn't called Gina, if he hadn't gotten there first. "Minutes," he admitted hoarsely. Gina made a broken sound and pressed both hands over her mouth. Tears filled her eyes instantly now, panic and horror replacing anger completely. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God." Marco shut his eyes briefly. He'd come so close to losing her. The realization had been clawing at him ever since Evelyn looked at him with terror in her eyes upstairs and whispered that she would have disappeared. Because she was right. Women vanished into those networks every day and were never seen again, buried beneath false names, foreign cities, locked rooms, endless violence. The thought of Evelyn trapped in that world made something black and murderous expand inside him until he could barely breathe around it. And the worst part? He knew exactly what he would have become if they'd taken her. Marco opened his eyes slowly, his voice dropping lower. If they had gotten her. He stopped, jaw flexing hard. "I would have burned down their entire world to find her." Melina's gaze sharpened on him immediately because she understood precisely what he meant. Marco wasn't exaggerating. He would have hunted every single person involved across countries if necessary. He would have ripped apart trafficking routes, bribed governments, destroyed businesses, tortured information out of men until his hands were stained with blood permanently. There would have been nowhere on earth those people could have hidden from him while Evelyn remained missing. "And I wouldn't have stopped," he finished quietly, "until every last one of them was dead and she was safe." Silence settled heavily through the office. Gina stared at her brother with tears still shining in her eyes, but there was no fear there, only grief and understanding, because she knew him, knew exactly how dangerous Marco became when someone he loved was threatened. And he loved Evelyn. He always had. 8 years. 8 years of watching her walk into family dinners carrying dessert because she never arrived empty-handed. 8 years of hearing her laugh with Gina in the kitchen late at night. 8 years of forcing himself to stay back while other men dated her because he knew his world was too dangerous to drag her into. He'd loved her quietly for so long it had become part of him. Something permanent. something buried so deeply even he stopped trying to fight it eventually. His mother had known almost immediately. Gina had figured it out shortly after. Neither of them had pushed him because they understood the problem. Marco Bianchi did not love safely. Men like him consumed, protected, destroyed threats without mercy, and Evelyn, with her soft heart and stubborn kindness, had always deserved gentleness instead of violence. But now, violence was exactly what this situation required. "They moved Rick," Marco said suddenly. Gina's head snapped up. "What?" "We found him," Marco said coldly. "Then someone tipped them off before we could get there." Fury sharpened every word now. "They hid him from me." Melina's expression darkened immediately. "Which means they know who you are." Marco gave one slow nod. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly because everyone in the city's underworld knew what it meant to provoke Marco Bianchi personally. There were men who feared prison less than they feared crossing him. Organizations that avoided touching anything tied to the Bianchi family because retaliation was brutal and absolute. And now traffickers had tried to take someone under his protection. Worse, someone he loved. Marco straightened slowly from the desk, every trace of softness gone from his face now, the grief, fear, and relief he'd been holding together since finding Evelyn had hardened into something far more dangerous. "They think hiding Rick protects them," he said quietly. Gina shivered slightly at his tone. Marco's eyes turned cold enough to freeze the room. "They're about to learn," he said, "exactly how ruthless I can be." It was Melina who finally broke the silence. "What about Evelyn?" Her voice was calm, measured carefully, despite the tension filling the office. Marco looked toward his mother slowly, while Gina stayed quiet for once, watching both of them closely. Melina folded her hands together atop the desk, her dark eyes unwavering on her son. She knew him too well to miss what sat beneath all that anger. Beneath the violence and vengeance simmering through him was fear, real fear, the kind a man only felt when the thing he loved almost disappeared forever. Marco's jaw tightened. "What about her?" Melina held his gaze steadily. "You stayed away from her to keep her safe." There was no accusation in her tone, only truth. And this was the result. The words landed hard because they were impossible to deny. Marco had spent years keeping distance between himself and Evelyn, convincing himself it was protection. No relationship meant no target painted on her back. No claim on her meant enemies would overlook her. But Evelyn had become part of this family long ago, regardless of whether Marco touched her or not. She sat at their tables. She was loved by their people. She was already woven into their world. Gina crossed her arms tightly. "She's been ours for years, Marco." Her voice softened slightly. "Everybody knows it." Then more pointedly, "The only people pretending otherwise are the two of you." Marco looked away sharply toward the window again, rain still streaking down the glass outside, because they weren't wrong. Evelyn had been at the center of his life for so long, he no longer knew where the line between friendship and something far more dangerous had blurred. He'd watched other men date her while forcing himself to remain silent. He'd convinced himself it was noble somehow, necessary. But now all he could think about was how close he'd come to losing her anyway, while she belonged to nobody officially at all. Melina rose from behind the desk and moved toward him slowly. "You cannot protect her from this life anymore, Marco," she said quietly. "She is already part of it." Her eyes sharpened slightly then, the softness fading into something more serious. "And if you keep trying to deny what you feel, instead of standing beside her properly, there will be a next time." Marco's expression hardened immediately at those words. But Melina didn't stop. Men like those do not forget humiliation. especially not when a woman escapes them. Her voice lowered carefully. Next time she may not be so lucky. A sharp knock interrupted the room before Marco could respond. Andrea stepped inside without waiting for permission, his expression stripped of its usual humor. "We found the warehouse," he said simply, "and words already spreading that you're looking personally." His eyes flicked briefly between Marco, Melina, and Gina, before settling back on Marco. "The cars are ready." The atmosphere in the office shifted instantly. Marco straightened slowly, every trace of emotion vanishing behind cold control again. The softness Evelyn always managed to pull from him disappeared beneath something darker, something far more dangerous. He crossed the room first toward his mother, leaning down to kiss Melina's cheek briefly. "Stay with Evelyn," he told her quietly. Melina touched his jaw for a moment, her eyes searching his face before she nodded once. Gina wrapped her arms around him next, without a word, squeezing tightly enough to betray the fear she was trying to hide. "Bring him back alive first," she muttered against his shoulder. "I want a turn." A faint, humorless smile touched Marco's mouth before he pulled away and headed for the door. The convoy waiting outside looked less like transportation and more like preparation for war. Black SUVs lined the driveway beneath the rain-dark sky, engines idling while armed men stood nearby speaking quietly into radios. Luca leaned against one vehicle checking ammunition, while Andrea barked orders further down the line. Marco climbed into the center vehicle without hesitation, fury settling cold and steady beneath his ribs. He wasn't simply going to collect Rick anymore. He was sending a message. They had touched the wrong woman. The warehouse sat far outside the city near abandoned industrial land and shipping yards, isolated enough for illegal business to move unnoticed. As Marco's convoy rolled through the gates, headlights sweeping across rusted fencing and stacked cargo containers, the men stationed outside immediately stiffened. Fear moved visibly through them once Marco stepped from the SUV. Good. He wanted them afraid. He wanted every single person connected to those trafficking routes to understand exactly who was hunting them now. Marco stopped in the center of the yard while his men spread behind him in a wall of black suits and quiet violence. The man running the operation, a thick-set older bastard named Vittorio, emerged slowly from the warehouse doors, trying and failing to appear calm. Marco could already see it in his eyes, though. Panic, because everyone in their world knew the difference between business retaliation and personal vengeance. And this was personal. "You have tonight," Marco said coldly, his voice carrying through the yard with terrifying calm. "Turn Rick over to me and I might leave your operation standing." Vittorio opened his mouth, but Marco silenced him with one sharp look. "Or I start visiting every establishment tied to your network." His expression darkened further. One by one, rain slid down the shoulders of his black coat as he stepped closer, deadly and composed all at once. "And when I'm finished, there won't be enough left of your empire to bury." Vittorio didn't hesitate. Marco saw the exact moment calculation overtook loyalty in the older man's eyes. Men like Vittorio survived because they understood risk, and right now the risk standing in front of him wore a black coat and looked one step away from unleashing absolute destruction. Rick meant nothing compared to the empire Vittorio had spent 30 years building through fear, smuggling, and dirty money. Protecting one desperate little snake wasn't worth losing everything. "Franco Vizzini has him," Vittorio said immediately. No denial, no bargaining, straight to survival. Rain hammered softly against the metal roofs around them, while Marco held his stare in silence for several long seconds. Around him his men remained motionless, weapons visible enough to keep everyone nervous. Vittorio swallowed once beneath the pressure of Marco's gaze and continued quickly. Rick panicked after what happened with the girl. Franco moved him before your people got there. His voice lowered carefully. He thought you'd react badly. A cold smile touched Marco's mouth. Did he? Nobody spoke. Marco stepped closer until Vittorio was forced to tilt his head slightly upward to maintain eye contact. Listen to me carefully, Marco said softly. Somehow the quietness in his voice made every word more threatening. The girls are done. His eyes hardened into something lethal. No more trafficking through my city, not through my ports, not through businesses connected to me, not through anyone who values breathing. Vittorio nodded immediately. Too quickly. Marco continued before he could speak. And if I find out, he said, voice dropping lower still, that anything tied to trafficking touches businesses where I hold personal interests. The implication hung heavily between them, because everyone there knew exactly what he meant now. Evelyn, I'll come back here myself. His expression became terrifyingly calm. And I'll bury every last one of you where you stand. Silence followed. Then Vittorio gave one careful nod, genuine fear finally breaking through fully, because Marco wasn't bluffing. Every man standing in that yard knew it. The Bianchis could be negotiated with in business matters. Territory disputes could be settled. Debts could be repaid. But this? A woman under Marco Bianchi's protection had almost been trafficked through their network. There would be no second warning. Marco turned away first. Find Franco, he ordered coldly to the men behind him, and bring me Rick. Franco Vizzini and Rick were dragged into Marco's warehouse in the shipping yards just after midnight. The enormous industrial space echoed with the sound of boots against concrete, while harsh overhead lights cast long shadows across the floor. Marco stood waiting near the center of the warehouse, with Luca and several of his men behind him, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his black coat. Calm, still, terrifyingly composed, the kind of composure that made grown men panic because it meant the violence hadn't started yet. Rick was already crying. His face was bruised from whatever Luca's men had done retrieving him, his hands zip-tied behind his back while terror practically poured off him in waves. Franco looked in far better condition physically, but Marco noticed the tension in his shoulders immediately. Good. At least one of them understood how serious this was. Rick saw Marco and nearly collapsed outright. Please, he started immediately, voice shaking violently. Marco, I swear to God, I didn't know. Shut him up, Marco said quietly. One of his men shoved Rick hard enough to silence him instantly. Marco's attention never even lingered there. Rick would be dealt with, slowly, personally, but right now Marco cared far more about the older man standing beside him. His gaze settled coldly onto Franco. You hid him from me, Marco said. Franco lifted his chin carefully despite the sweat gathering along his temple. Business misunderstanding, he replied cautiously. The kid panicked. I was trying to prevent unnecessary escalation. A humorless smile touched Marco's mouth. Unnecessary. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop. Marco stepped closer slowly, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Franco now. You thought protecting him was worth risking a war with me? His voice remained dangerously soft. For a man who tried to sell a woman under my protection? At that, Franco hesitated. Tiny, barely noticeable. But Marco caught it immediately, and suddenly instinct sharpened viciously inside him. Why? Marco asked quietly. Franco said nothing. Rick broke first. I didn't know, he blurted out desperately. I swear to God I didn't know who she was. Tears streamed openly down his face now, while panic wrecked his voice. Evie never talked about you people. She kept her work and friends separate. she never mentioned Gina was a Bianchi. Marco went completely still. Rick continued rambling frantically, words tumbling out in terror now. Franco saw her once and wanted her. That's all it was. He choked on a sob. He said he'd keep her for himself first, before moving her on somewhere else when he got bored. Silence crashed through the warehouse. Luca swore viciously under his breath. One of Marco's men physically stepped forward, because everyone there understood exactly what Rick had just admitted. Franco didn't even deny it. Marco looked at him slowly, very slowly, and for the first time that night, the calm finally disappeared from his face entirely. Murder entered the room. "She belongs to me," Marco repeated softly, like he genuinely couldn't believe the audacity. Franco's composure cracked. "Marco!" The gunshot echoed deafeningly through the warehouse. Franco dropped instantly. Rick screamed. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Smoke curled faintly from the gun in Marco's hand, while Franco collapsed heavily against the concrete floor, blood spreading rapidly beneath him. Marco didn't even glance down. His chest rose once sharply, fury burning so hot beneath his skin he could barely see straight anymore. Evelyn. They had looked at Evelyn and seen merchandise. Something to use, to own, to destroy. Marco turned toward Rick next. Rick started sobbing outright. "Please, please, Marco, I swear." Another gunshot rang out. Then silence. Marco lowered the weapon slowly, breathing hard once through his nose, before handing the gun calmly back to Luca, like nothing extraordinary had happened at all. "Burn everything tied to Franco's trafficking routes," he said coldly. "Every warehouse, every shipment, every account." His eyes remained fixed on the bodies at his feet. "And if there's anyone left connected to this operation by morning," his expression turned lethal again. "Finish it." Evelyn hadn't seen Marco properly in days. Not really. She caught glimpses of him the same way someone caught sight of storms moving along the horizon. Brief, distant, impossible to hold on to. A shadow crossing the hallway late at night. The low murmur of his voice somewhere downstairs. Once she heard him laughing quietly with Luca in the courtyard, before silence followed the second she appeared. Every time she entered a room, he seemed to have just left it. At first, she blamed work, then recovery, then exhaustion. But after nearly a week, even Evelyn couldn't ignore the obvious anymore. Marco was avoiding her, and somehow that irritated her far more than it should have. Gina, infuriatingly, had become suspiciously quiet whenever Evelyn brought him up. Normally, Gina would happily overshare every detail of her brother's life, with dramatic commentary attached. Now she just made vague noises and changed the subject. Luca looked awkward whenever Marco's name surfaced. Andrea outright fled one conversation entirely. The whole family was behaving like everyone knew something she didn't, and Evelyn was rapidly losing patience with all of them. The good news was she finally felt human again. The fever was gone. Her strength mostly returned, and the bruising on her face had faded enough. She no longer looked like she'd survived hand-to-hand combat. She'd resumed working remotely from the enormous kitchen most mornings, translating legal and financial documents for Peterson, while Melina supervised the household around her like an elegant general. The familiarity of work helped settle her restless mind somewhat, though every now and then thoughts of Rick and Franco still hit hard enough to make her chest tighten. Mostly, though, she kept thinking about Marco, about the things she'd admitted while panicking, about the way he'd held her afterward, and then promptly disappeared. By the fourth day of being politely avoided, Evelyn was done being patient. That morning over coffee, she'd casually asked Melina if Marco was actually in the house today. Melina had glanced up from her newspaper with an expression far too knowing, before calmly replying, in his office. Then, after a beat, try not to kill each other. The carpets are expensive. Now Evelyn marched down the hallway, fueled entirely by irritation and stubbornness. She didn't bother knocking. The office door swung open sharply as she strode inside, with far more confidence than she actually felt. Marco stood near the windows with his back to the door, one hand braced against the desk, while the other held his phone. Even from behind, he looked tense somehow. Broad shoulders rigid beneath the black dress shirt he'd rolled to his forearms. He went still the second she entered. Slowly, Marco turned around. His expression shifted immediately upon seeing her. Surprise first, then something darker, something carefully restrained. Evelyn planted her hands on her hips before he could speak. "Oh no," she announced firmly. "We're having this out." Marco blinked once. She pointed accusingly at him. "You do not get to save my life, hold me while I have an emotional breakdown, disappear for days, and then pretend I hallucinated the entire thing." Her voice rose slightly with every sentence now that she'd started. "Enough is enough, Marco." Her eyes narrowed. "You're either avoiding me because of what I said or because of what you said, and frankly, I'm irritated enough now that I don't even care which one it is anymore." Marco ended the call slowly, setting the phone down on the desk with deliberate care before turning his full attention back to Evelyn. For a moment, he simply looked at her standing there in his office, flushed with frustration and determination, hands on her hips like a scolding school teacher, prepared to drag the truth out of him by force if necessary. God, he loved her. The realization hit with painful clarity now that there was no distance left to hide behind. He tried for diplomacy anyway. "Evelyn," he started carefully, voice quieter now, "there are things happening right now that you don't need involved in." He kept his tone controlled, measured, trying to guide her away from dangerous truths without lying to her outright. Because how could he explain what he'd become to protect her? What he'd done? There was blood on his hands now, more than there had been before, and all of it traced back to the moment he imagined her disappearing into that world, broken, lost, gone. He didn't want her carrying that weight, didn't want her seeing him clearly enough to realize exactly how ruthless he could be. Or worse, he didn't want her afraid of him. Marco swallowed once, jaw tightening. "You should stay out of this." Evelyn stared at him in silence for one long second before crossing the room toward him. Not away. Toward. Marco's breath caught slightly as she stopped directly in front of him, close enough he could feel the warmth of her body now. Her eyes searched his face carefully, softening when she found whatever she'd been looking for there. Guilt, fear, self-loathing. She saw too much, too easily, sometimes. Slowly, Evelyn reached down and took one of his hands between both of hers. The same hands he'd stained for her. The same hands he'd feared she would recoil from if she ever learned the truth. Instead, Evelyn lifted them gently toward her face and pressed a kiss against his knuckles. Marco froze completely. Then another against his jaw, soft, careful, intentional. Finally, she rose onto her toes slightly and kissed him properly. The world seemed to stop. Marco made a rough sound low in his throat before both arms wrapped around her instinctively, pulling her hard against his chest, like he physically couldn't get close enough. 8 years. 8 years of denying himself this, of stepping back every time he wanted to touch her, of watching other men stand where he wanted to stand, of convincing himself distance was safer when all it had done was leave her vulnerable and him half insane with restraint. He couldn't do it anymore, not after almost losing her, not after hearing her whisper she didn't want to die without kissing him. Marco kissed her back like a starving man finally allowed to eat, one hand sliding into her hair while the other held her firmly against him. Evelyn melted into him immediately, fingers curling tightly into the front of his shirt, as though she'd been waiting just as long. The kiss deepened slowly, years of tension and buried feeling unraveling all at once between them until breathing itself became difficult. When Marco finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers while both of them struggled slightly for air. "I tried to stay away from you," he admitted roughly. Evelyn touched his face gently. "I know." His eyes closed briefly. "I can't anymore." A small smile touched her lips, despite the emotion shining in her eyes. "Good," she whispered softly, "because I'm pretty sure I've been in love with you for most of my adult life." They talked for a long time after that. Not with the urgency and tension that had filled every conversation between them lately, but quietly, honestly. Evelyn stayed curled against Marco on the office sofa, while rain tapped softly against the windows outside, his arm wrapped securely around her like he still needed the reassurance she was really there. For the first time in years, there were no carefully maintained walls between them, no pretending, no stepping around feelings both of them had been carrying far too long. They didn't talk about Rick. Marco clearly expected questions eventually, expected fear or horror, once she connected the pieces of what he'd done after finding out the truth. Evelyn could see it sitting heavily behind his eyes, every time silence stretched too long. The guilt, the violence, the weight of being a man forced to make terrible choices in order to protect the people he loved. But Evelyn knew enough already. She knew Marco. She knew what kind of fury lived inside him when someone threatened his family, and she knew in her heart exactly how far he would have gone for her. So instead of asking for details she never truly wanted, Evelyn reached up and touched his face gently. "You protected me," she said softly. Marco's jaw tightened immediately. "I failed to keep you safe in the first place." "No." Her voice remained calm but firm enough that he looked at her properly. "You came for me." Her fingers brushed lightly through the dark hair at the nape of his neck. "Whatever happened after that?" She exhaled quietly. "I don't need to know everything, Marco. I think part of loving someone is understanding there are things they carry that hurt them." Her eyes softened painfully. "But you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Something in his expression cracked slightly then. Marco lowered his forehead briefly against hers, one hand tightening around her waist almost unconsciously. Evelyn could feel the tension living inside him still, the exhaustion and darkness he kept buried beneath control. For years he'd convinced himself loving her meant staying away. Protecting her meant isolating himself with every burden and ugly thing his world demanded. But Evelyn had never once looked at him like a monster. Even now she only held him closer. "Because I'm staying," she whispered. Marco looked at her sharply at those words. Evelyn smiled softly then, warmth returning to her eyes for the first time since everything happened. "You're stuck with me now, Bianchi." Her lips twitched faintly. "Which means eventually we're going to have cute little children running around this house causing chaos." A grin spread slowly across her face. "They'll have a fiercely protective father, an awesome aunt, and hopefully look like their devastatingly cute uncle." Marco stared at her in stunned silence for half a second, before a rough laugh escaped him unexpectedly. "Poor bastard," he muttered. As though summoned by disrespect alone, the office door suddenly swung open. Luca stepped halfway inside, holding paperwork, before freezing immediately at the sight of them wrapped around each other on the sofa. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why do I feel insulted and I haven't even heard the conversation yet?" Evelyn burst into helpless laughter against Marco's shoulder, while Marco finally smiled fully for the first time in days. You have excellent timing, Marco deadpanned. Luca pointed between them accusingly. No, absolutely not. I can feel emotional damage occurring in this room right now. I think I have PTSD. Evelyn wiped tears of laughter from her eyes and grinned. We were just discussing how our future children will obviously inherit your good looks. You know a little healthy competition never hurt anyone. Luca looked horrified. Marco laughed, warm and accepting and ready for whatever challenges Evelyn brought down upon them, because life was certainly about to get interesting.